When we're thinking about models to emulate, whether they're models at a local level, a city, say, or a country, at the national level, we're looking mostly at small countries. You know, people always raise the examples of Iceland, for instance, Finland, New Zealand. These are, in terms of population, pretty small countries. They've been pretty successful in terms of engaging citizens in renewal projects of one sort or another. In the case of New Zealand, the response to extremism, led by a prime minister who has really done basically all the right things in terms of reaching out to affected community, but also proposing a pretty ambitious effort to roll back guns in the country, and yet at the same time connecting New Zealand internationally to an effort to address hate speech in the digital realm. So here you have a country that is pretty small, hasn't played a major role internationally, but has really, through a combination of political wisdom and some civil society traditions, is now essentially punching above its weight, although perhaps that metaphor is not the best metaphor. I mean, here's an interesting example, especially an example for our times here in the United States, and that would be Burlington, Vermont. When Bernie Sanders won as mayor back in, it was the early 80s, people were skeptical that this self-professed socialist was going to be able to make any difference in Burlington. And yeah, Burlington was a liberal place, but Vermont as a state is pretty conservative. And what Sanders did was quite interesting. First of all, he partnered more with Republicans than Democrats on the city council to get legislation passed, because he recognized the Republicans were really the power holders in the city. And two, he reached out to the business community for a number of initiatives, including a pretty major development project. And he never backed down from his ideals. He just said, look, I'm a politician and I want to ensure that we push Burlington forward as a city. And as an example of municipal activism, because in order to get this done, it couldn't just be at the kind of elite political level. He had to enlist the support of civil organizations all the way through this city. It was really actually quite extraordinary. An extraordinary example of transpartisanism. I mean, this is even before we started talking about blue and red states. So that's a really kind of interesting example of how one can get things done and Burlington was at that time hyper politicized in the split between Democrats and Republicans on city council, and yet he was able to step in some sense as an outsider and get things done. And he couldn't have done that without a kind of a group of supporters, again, throughout civil society within Burlington. Those are, again, two examples, either New Zealand or Burlington, Vermont. They're relatively small, and there seems to be, in both cases, an opportunity an opportunity by an outsider to play a key role in galvanizing change. For larger entities, the United States, the European Union, Brazil, it's hard to imagine some comparable process. And yet we have been surprised in the past when it has happened. I mean, in Brazil with Lula really did cut across many political loyalties in pushing through his Bolsa, for instance, his initiative to raise the income of the lowest third of Brazilian society. The EU as an entity, everyone complains it is overly bureaucratic, and yet we've seen visionary leaders at the beginning of the process and even midway through who have push the EU in directions which are actually quite dramatic, whether it's through actual territorial expansion and through inclusion of new members, or the transformation of policy at an all-European level. For instance, the transformation of agricultural policy in a greener direction. So it is possible. I think the most dramatic examples are often the smaller ones, but I don't want to preclude the possibility that such dramatic transformation can take place in larger entities as well. The question of how we are addressing the underlying support, for instance, for Donald Trump or the far right, I don't really think it has been addressed in any significant way by the Democrats in the primary. There is obviously some discussion of how to go after Trump voters, bring them back into the Democratic fold. We saw a tremendous number of people switch from 2012 to 2016. Quite a few Obama voters ended up voting for Donald Trump. We even saw quite a few Bernie Sanders voters vote for Donald Trump. So the Democrats are going to have to be asking, these questions of how to attract back these voters, and so they generally are going to be asking tactical questions rather than strategic ones. How can we appeal to them in this election cycle, as opposed to how can we implement policies that ensure that they vote for progressive policies from now into the future. But that's a conversation that is going to take place within the Democratic Party as a whole, rather than, I think, between the candidates in the primary. And there is going to be quite a conflict within the Democratic Party between its more progressive wing and its more conservative wing. I would argue that if we look long term, the progressive wing has more of the answers. If we're talking about just winning the 2020 election, the progressive wing might not have the answers for the short term. I mean, that's a paradox that we have to deal with, because sometimes in order to win an election, you have to appeal to a very specific set of constituencies, and that specific set of constituencies is not interested at that moment in long-term questions. It's interested in some very short-term fixes or appeals. And that isn't necessarily what the progressive wing is going to be offering necessarily. In terms of addressing this kind of challenge between short-term questions of electability and winning an election and long-term structural transformation, when we think about the New Deal, for instance, it's not like Franklin Roosevelt came into office saying, I'm going to do a New Deal, and you have to take that on faith and vote for me based on this grandiose plan that I've just laid out for you. The New Deal only became popular in some sense after it had started, after the FDR could say, well, this is what we've achieved. It has a track record. It's not utopian, it's a set of policy initiatives. I think essentially we're going to have to deal with something similar to that for the progressives. I think it's tough to go out there and say Green New Deal and expect that people are going to vote for something that is 3 pages long, is just kind of a laundry list of hoped for changes. People will support a Green New Deal when their cousin got a job as a result of the Green New Deal, or because they have a new metro system that is in their town, or they are not, outside playing soccer in 60-degree weather in February. They see that there's an actual transformation in our carbon footprint and in the daily lives of people. So that, I think, is where kind of long-term structural change hits, the electability question. You have to get things started. how you get into office, how you make the kind of necessary political compromises to get your big picture structural transformation on the table, that's another set of questions. But I think, another example would be, the European Union as a concept was popular initially, of course, because countries in Europe were coming out of war. But it was built on actual, compromise around coal and steel. And so, the European Union was not this idea that we're all going to get together and sing and, dance around as 12, 16, 20, 28 nations. It was based on some very, very specific compromises that had very concrete results. And only later on did the European Union begin to exert a kind of loyalty among the various nations of Europe, but it only did so as a result of the results. I can travel. I can travel without, showing my passport at the border. I can get a job in another country, just like that. And then suddenly, this thing, this EU, which some people have criticized because it's overly bureaucratic, or what happened to our lovely currency. No, concrete benefits. I see the concrete benefits of this. Of course I'm going to love the EU.